So today I'm going to talk much more tactically about how at Universal Health Services we're using Lean to create a better patient experience by creating operational throughput. So a couple of things to keep in mind. A number of speakers have talked about customer experience. Patient experience in a hospital setting, so we're a provider, is just a little bit different. Remember, when you go to a hospital, or I'm actually going to talk specifically about emergency departments, when you go to an emergency department, people are going to do things to you that are uncomfortable, perhaps painful, maybe embarrassing, and you're sick or injured and usually anxious. Right? So those things add some dimensions to the customer experience that usually aren't necessarily present in other kinds of interactions. So first, of course, a quick overview of Universal Health Services. We're a hospital management company. We operate behavioral health organizations, about 250 of those around the United States and in England, and 26 acute care hospitals. And I'm on the acute care side. So these dots show you our acute care hospitals. They're spread all over the United States. With those 26 acute care hospitals, we operate 26 acute care emergency departments and 4 freestanding emergency departments. And today we have about 4 other freestanding emergency departments under construction. So we're expanding our emergency department footprint very rapidly, and that changes the nature of some of these customer or patient interactions that I'm going to talk about. The other thing, we see about 3,100 patients a day in our emergency departments. So that's 3,100 opportunities for us to either get something right or to drive a patient to our competitor. A little quick thing about emergency departments to help you understand the context. Emergency department visits have been growing at about 3% a year since the early 90s, which is interesting. With all the population changes, that number has been very consistent until the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as some folks call it, which, by the way, 7 years old today. With that Affordable Care Act, we had a little blip, then the numbers resumed their trend, but the nature of the patients changed. With more people having insurance, people began to use our emergency departments as really a place for unscheduled care. Okay? So the nature of those interactions became more complex. People, instead of using what traditionally, when I was much younger, we used physician offices for those providers of services. Today, more and more people use emergency departments or some other means of unscheduled type care, and especially, interestingly, especially millennials, they seem to especially appreciate that idea of when I want health care, I want it now, and don't bother me with all these making appointments things. But that cuts across almost all age groups. So in the emergency care system, about 20 to 30% of the patients we see in our emergency departments result in inpatient admissions, which drive our bricks and mortar hospitals. But 50 to 60% of those inpatient admissions come from our emergency departments. So really, the emergency department for our bricks and mortar hospital, the emergency department is the front door. And today, with more emergency beds, with freestanding emergency departments, with urgent care clinics, minute clinic, and all this other proliferation of unscheduled care, the competition for these patients becomes much more intense. And so in the last few years, and really in an accelerating trend, we moved from what traditionally was a provider-centric model. Okay? It was all about us, it was all about the providers, and the patients had to wait. And if you've ever been to an emergency department, most of you probably experienced that. People in healthcare say they're all there for the patients, but in reality, we didn't really care that much about the patients. Now, new reality, we have to care about the patients. So now we're in a more kind of relationship-centric model. What's important to the patients, our customers, becomes critically important to us. And so we have to have a patient experience that works better than it did in the past because you have so many more options. So when we think about that whole experience piece, we have tons of data going back 30, 40 years in terms of patient satisfaction. And that data tells us that patients generally want three things. And first, interestingly enough, is they want to be cared about as a person. Okay? I personally think that's because hospitals typically dehumanize patients, right? You were the gallbladder in room 3, the broken leg in room 2. And second, they want to, in the emergency department, they want to be seen by a provider quickly, and they want to have the whole experience completed quickly. Which kind of, as a lean person, that kind of goes a little bit to my sweet spot. So that worked out pretty doggone well. So we first started looking at that whole idea of seeing patients quickly, and we measure that experience through a metric called leave without being seen. You come to an emergency department, and before seeing a physician or a mid-level provider, you leave. In 2013, which is the first year we had data for all of our hospitals, we were experiencing a rate of about 1.9%, which is not horrible. The national average is about 2%, but from our point of view, that doesn't seem very good. And so our goal was 1%. At the end of 2016, we were, as a division, we were at 0.8%, but you can see from the graphic that a number of our hospitals have pushed down to about 0.5%. Though you can also see we still have some variation that we're going to have to work on. But we started getting patients in quickly, and we did that by looking at the patient in more of an experienced way, coupled with the process. And we worked on two basic principles. When you come to the emergency department, the reason you come is to be seen by a physician or a provider and get treated. So we should do everything possible to move that along. Now, some of you are like, yeah, Chuck, that's common sense, but believe me, that's not the way an emergency department worked. So when you come to our emergency department, when you walk in the door, you're seen by a person with medical training. Generally, it's a nurse, it might be an ED tech, but it's not a registration clerk, it's not a security guard. We see you and we quickly pivot you into a treatment space so that we can begin the treatment. So before, we typically had a process like wait, register, wait, triage, wait. Right? Very frustrating for people who don't feel good. Now that whole process is accomplished in about 5 minutes. We get people back, and when we have rooms in the back, we skip that whole front end process and simply take patients right to the back. What our staff affectionately calls pull until full. Don't leave a bunch of rooms sitting idle in your emergency department and have a bunch of patients out in the waiting room. Again, all this stuff sounds like common sense, but not really common practice. So the other thing is we started combining the registration and triage function and doing it in parallel, and we leaned down that function by saying we only want to do the things that a patient absolutely has to have done right that minute to get them processed into the back. In the past, that whole triage process would sometimes take 10, 15, 20 minutes because we had piled it up with a bunch of junk. So we got rid of that junk, and so we can register and triage a patient and get them in the back in 5 minutes. So we felt pretty good about that. In 2016, we started looking at the rest of the process. Now, one of the things that's weird about throughput in an emergency department is improving the front-end throughput does not improve the overall throughput. Okay? There's a bunch of barriers that you get to once you get in the treatment space that no matter how fast you make that front end, the overall process doesn't contract. But way fewer patients were leaving. So those, by the way, those patients who were leaving, every 1% drop for us is worth $30 million. So, sweet. Patients were happier, and by the way, we were a lot happier too. So from there, we started looking at the overall throughput. And here's where we, again, started trying to focus on that whole patient experience. So you can see up to about 2015, we have steadily increasing times in the throughput. So this is door to door. The blue bars for patients who are going to be admitted. The green bars for patients who are going to be discharged back out to their home. In 2015, 9 hours. The average was 9 hours. If you came to our emergency department and were going to be admitted. So, by the way, not only did you have a miserable experience in our emergency department, you had a miserable experience in the whole hospital, because how were you going to have a good experience after that awful start? So we started focusing not on the middle of the emergency department process where all the treatment goes, but we started focusing on some of the back end of the emergency department process. And that's where things were kind of hinky. There were all kinds of delays in the process of getting a patient, once we knew they were going to be admitted, getting them up to the floor. You would think that process would be pretty simple, but the whole process of getting patients out of the inpatient bed was bottlenecked. The handoffs were bottlenecked. The transfer from ED physicians to hospitalists had all sorts of delays. The ED nurse transferring information to the inpatient nurse had all sorts of delays. The ED physicians would batch orders at the very end of the process, thus slowing everything down. And to add insult to injury, sometimes we didn't have all the registration, financial type information we needed, and we delayed patients getting out of the emergency department for that. So patients laid around in a very uncomfortable environment, waiting for those inpatient beds. So I'm going to talk about a specific example of how we improved this and what happened. This is Lakewood Ranch Medical Center. It's in Bradenton, Florida, about 2 hours actually over toward Tampa from here. And you can see that up through 2015, they look very similar to our UHS numbers. A little better, they were only at about 6 hours. Still nothing, nothing I would want to write my mother about, but a little better. In 2016, we started working with them. They were actually our beta site for our improvement efforts. You can see they dropped significantly in 2016, and I had some data right before I had to send this in from the first part of 2017. They're under our 4-hour goal. So we have a goal, 4 hours, 80% of the time for admitted patients, 150 minutes for patients who are discharged home, and we're slowly ratcheting down those goals. We're down to actually 120 minutes for patients discharged home now as a goal. So we continue to evolve that. So this is the back end of the process, from when an admission order was written until the patient left the department to go upstairs. When we started, that time was 180 minutes, 3 hours after we finished treating you. And that was not atypical, by the way. We didn't pick this hospital because they had the worst times. This is a typical experience for our patients, unfortunately, at that time. You can see as we began to lean that out, those times started to drop. Had some problems with consistent execution, right? Sustainability. Kind of worked our way through that, and now we seem to be kind of under our goal, which our goal for the back end of the process is 60 minutes. So that's consistent with our 4 hours. The time it takes to get a bed, assign a bed, get the patient ready to move, do some report. 60 minutes, we'll probably be cutting that down over time, but for now, we've got a lot of work to get all of our hospitals down to this goal. So again, fairly simple kinds of lean application. Clearly defined roles, making sure that admission criteria were set for everyone so that people didn't push back. And a couple of simple techniques that greatly improved our patient experience. And that was pull kind of versus push. For intensive care patients who are a little more medically complex, when a bed is assigned, the ICU nurse comes from the unit to the emergency department, receives report in the room with the patient and their family, and then transports that patient back to their ICU bed. Okay? That humanized that whole handoff process and made that whole experience so much better for the patients. And it was so simple when we thought about what do patients want. They want to feel like we care. How do we feel like we care? make the handoff less impersonal. In our med-surg units, they have the nurses there have bigger patient loads. We can't really free them up, and those patients they don't need a nurse to transport them. When the bed's assigned, that nurse calls the emergency department and gets reports. So we eliminate those report delays that were clogging up our system. And then the nurse goes to the patient's room and double checks to make sure that everything's in there. Okay, how embarrassing is a patient when you go up to a room and there's no bed in there? There's no monitor, there's no IV stand. Okay, would you feel like people cared about you if that happened to you? No. So the nurse double checks that, has a little bit of time because the emergency department starts transporting that patient immediately after report. The patient gets to the room, that nurse is in the room, and we make that handoff. Again, that nurse and our script for telling the patient what we're doing is, your nurse called, they're ready for you, we're going to move you up to the inpatient unit. Again, much better than, hey, we have to get you out of here because we're really busy and you're just clogging up the works. And we generally didn't say that, but honestly, not too far from that sometimes. So, in patient experience, one of the variables that's highly correlated to the idea of likelihood to recommend is, of course, how we treat you. But in the emergency department especially, one of the other variables is how well the staff keeps you informed. And we picked that variable to try to optimize in the patient experience. So at Lakewood Ranch, when we started, compared to other hospitals, this hospital was in the 44th percentile for that metric. When we finished, they were in the 99th percentile. Okay? All because we designed a process where the communication was built into the process. Oh, and by the way, since we weren't holding you for 9, 10, 12, 14 hours, we didn't have to communicate about delays as much because the process flowed smoothly. So having that process that flowed smoothly with those important communication features that humanize that process built in allowed us to make huge changes in that patient experience. And today, after we've been doing this a while, we do have some data that suggests that patient experience is highly tied to your length of stay. But where that gets murky is if you treat people poorly, it doesn't matter how short the stay is. So you have to have both those variables. And for us, that's a little bit difficult to sort out today. So you can see at Lakewood Ranch, leave without being seen, 1.6 to 0.3%, huge improvement. The time dropped from about 6 hours down to below 4 hours. And I already talked a little bit about the whole improvement in the patient satisfaction. And by the way, because patients were happier, physicians were happier, staff was happier, everybody had a better experience. And hopefully that will then translate into patients continuing to come back to our various emergency departments. So we're implementing this in other parts of our organization. Remember, 26 hospitals, 30 EDs. We're working on this in about 6 other EDs. We see definite benefits. A little too early to have really good numbers to share with you, but we still have a lot of work to do. It'll probably take us all of 2017 and into 2018 to get that pushed into all of our hospitals. Then we're going to be coming back and working on this no-way ED concept, which is kind of the next big thing that we've got a little work to figure out. But the main thing is we're going to continue to work on infusing the process with both lean thinking and this idea of informed communication. All right, I think that pretty much, I'm out of time, so thank you guys very much.